of you who are captured by the conference had to come because Matt came and picked you up in the van this morning. But for those of you who are from Victoria on a beautiful day like this, thank you for coming, and thank you so much, Paul, and to the Center for organizing this and for inviting me, including me in this group. I'm really pleased to be able to speak to you this morning. So, I think all of our papers concentrate on either Canada or the West. Certainly mine does, and I guess that's the way I would start. I don't think that there's anything new about religious conflicts. But in the last 20 years, the West has witnessed an increase in religious conflicts and more intensive struggles between religious groups, often non-Christian ones, and the state. Now, a growing number of these disputes make their ways to the courts. And when they do, two principles or two issues are often considered central to the decisions or to the outcomes of these decisions, which are mainly about contested religious beliefs. And these two principles or issues are religious equality and religious liberty. So, first of all, with respect to religious equality, many religious conflicts that have arisen in the last 20 years are conflicts in which religious minorities are mobilized to contest the terms of their access to the benefits of citizenship. For example, by engaging in debates about the legal recognition of religious arbitration, by engaging in debates about prohibitions on wearing headscarves and kirpans, about censoring blasphemous cartoons, about the criminalization of polygamy, to name just a few examples. So in the context of these struggles, religious minorities have argued that the protection and accommodation of some aspect of their distinctive identities is a requirement of equal citizenship, in the sense that the failure of the state to recognize and accommodate their religious commitments and practices amounts to a form of social exclusion, and thereby a failure to treat the religious minority with equal respect. So the first issue is equal respect or equality, religious equality. The second issue is whether state protection or accommodation is required in order to protect religious freedom. Does the failure to accommodate or protect a particular religious practice or belief deny adherents an important religious liberty? That is, does it deny them religious freedom? There are many examples of this. In fact, many that I just mentioned are also examples of in which the issue of religious freedom is at stake. But to take just one of them, in Quebec, the conflict over whether Sikh boys would be allowed to wear real kirpans strapped to their bodies when they go to public school turned in part on whether wearing a symbolic replica of the dagger on a necklace was sufficient to meet Sikh religious obligations. Is wearing a real kirpan indeed an important and central requirement for the boys or for Sikhism? I'll leave that open for a second. Or is it a display of excessive religious orthodoxy? Conflicts about headscarves in France went the same way in some cases. Certainly the conflict over cartoons depicting Mohammed in Denmark, the preservation of sites of religious significance in Scotland, animal ritual slaughter in Spain and Denmark and Belgium, and many other places, all have raised questions about whether a controversial religious practice is authentic, and by authentic I mean central and important to the religious beliefs of claimants, or whether claimants or their religious leaders are sometimes acting strategically and opportunistically in advancing some of these claims. So now both issues about religious equality and about religious freedom raise a dilemma for public institutions, and my focus is courts, but I'm interested in thinking about this outside a court context. But they raise a kind of dilemma that I call the dilemma of religious authenticity. So the dilemma of religious authenticity goes something like this. On the one hand, conflicts framed in terms of religious equality or in terms of religious freedom sometimes require that courts assess the authenticity, that is, the centrality and importance of a religious belief or practice, in the sense that courts have to distinguish between genuine and fraudulent religious claims, or they have to interrogate the meaning and importance of religious beliefs and practices in order to establish whether something important about the claimant's religious beliefs is being limited or jeopardized. And the dilemma is that we don't think, we as in the public in liberal democratic societies generally don't think they should be doing this, and courts don't really want to do this. So let me tell you a little bit about why I think they have to do this. In cases about religious equality, for example, the aim of the court is to guarantee religious freedom equally to all individuals, regardless of religious faith. But the guarantee of religious equality or non-discrimination relies on a standard measure against which to assess whether the level of religious freedom enjoyed by each claimant is equal religious freedom. And how this measure is determined is bound to be informed by considerations that are internal to religious faiths. So the example I would give would be the Hanukkah versus Christmas example. If we decided that we were only going to protect, that all people should be given Christmas off, and Jews might, no, Jews would never say, then the state might suggest that, well, then to be equitable, Hanukkah should be given off. But Hanukkah is just not as important a holiday to Jews as Christmas is to Christians, so getting Hanukkah off is not equal. It's not symmetrical to getting Christmas off. It's, in the scheme of things, Hanukkah is a minor holiday. Okay, so that's religious equality. It would require that you actually investigate internal to the religion in order to know what is equal. As Cecile Laborde says, equality, religious equality must raise the question, equality of what? And the second you start asking that question of religious faiths, it becomes a question internal to the religious faith. So similarly in the case of religious freedom, the question for the court is whether prohibiting or failing to accommodate a religious practice is jeopardizing something important and central to the religious faith, or something contingent and even frivolous. So both kinds of, and that also asks that we look internally to the faith. So both kinds of determinations of equality and liberty require courts to investigate matters internal to claimants of religious faith. And again, the dilemma is that we don't think really that courts, generally, if you look at the debates in the West, we don't think that courts should be doing that. Shashmita gave us a presentation yesterday about the Shabanu case, of course, which is precisely the same kind of debate about courts going internal to religious dogma. But let me just unpack why I think this is especially true in Canada, United States. And I would just give 3 reasons why we tend not to think this is a good idea. First, we think that when courts would, in looking internal to religious dogma, would interfere and even undermine the highly personal and subjective nature of religious freedom when they assess what is authentic to religious communities. So, for example, according to the view we find in liberal political philosophy, the state should protect the right of individuals to choose, interpret, and reflect on their own religious commitments. This is about individuals doing it. It's up to individuals perceived as moral agents capable of providing themselves with their own conception of the good to position themselves in relation to different understandings of the world and of the meaning of human life. So on some interpretations, religious freedom is an extension of individual freedom of conscience, as someone mentioned yesterday, which ought to be protected in terms that respect the deeply personal and highly subjective nature of religious moral commitments. And when put into practice, this view requires state institutions, such as courts, to respect the interpretation and significance that individuals vest in their beliefs by displaying sensitivity only to the personal and subjective dimensions of religious belief and faith. And in Canada, courts do this by looking at this, what individuals hold as sincerely held religious beliefs. So according to the liberal account, the state should only seek to establish the authenticity of religious belief and practice by assessing what individuals sincerely believe is required by their religious or spiritual commitments. And in doing so, leave aside all further considerations about what counts as authentic religious obligation, especially those accounts that are based on religious community practice or religious doctrine. The second reason why I think that we do not want courts doing this is because our courts have been very explicit in saying that they don't want to do this. that in fact courts go outside their expertise and legitimate role when they assess religious dogma or canonical interpretations. As Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin has stated in the Amsalem case, when courts undertake the task of analyzing religious doctrine, they enter forbidden domain. It is not within the expertise and purview of secular courts to adjudicate questions of religious doctrine. And the third reason why I think that it generates a dilemma is because when we look at the evidence of courts doing this from around the world, including Shabanu, but also lots of cases in Britain and Canada and the United States, we find that courts do this poorly. That is that the social scientific evidence shows that courts entrench stereotypes about religious minorities, that they entrench patriarchy and other forms of elite power. And perhaps this is because sometimes judges rely too heavily on conservative notions about group identities that are already entrenched in law and politics. Legal processes rely heavily on the discretion of judges who are overwhelmingly drawn from members of the majority elite and whose perspectives sometimes rigidly reflect broader public stereotypes and misinformation about minorities. So where these conservative attitudes are uncontested, and the court is kind of this rarefied context, the risk is that legal reasoning, which is more sensitive to identity claims, religious identity claims, may thereby become less sensitive to the interests of dissenting, marginalized, and more vulnerable members of religious communities. So I think that these are important concerns, and I think that it's an interesting dilemma, but I also think it's a dilemma, and I think it's unrealistic to think that courts and other public institutions will not be involved in sometimes adjudicating, interpreting, and assessing the meaning, importance, and centrality of religious commitments in a way that goes far beyond individual sincerity. I think it's unrealistic for three reasons I'll just mention. One thing is I think it trivializes, to only look at individual sincerity trivializes the communal nature of many religious commitments. And I think courts sometimes recognize this. Secondly, I think that some of the cases, specifically cases about religious equality where the principle of equality is at stake, that you can't protect the groups against discrimination, or you can't shield individuals from being, of religious communities, from being exposed to discrimination and disrespect only by focusing on individual sincerity. And here I'm thinking of some of the peyote case in the United States, Oregon versus Smith, in which some of the most interesting parts of that decision are parts that do not focus on whether Smith and Black are sincere in their belief that they should take peyote, but rather in the way in which the state's prohibition on peyote has been a form of group-based persecution. And that was in one of the, that would be off the map if it was only individual sincerity that courts were concerned about. And thirdly, I just think that you can't just rely on sincerity without thinking that you're thereby incorporating measures that are measures by which to assess what counts as sincerity. And those measures have to be internal to religious beliefs. That is, what it counts for me to be a religious Jew has to somehow be internal to Judaism in the sense, and this might be connected to the communal nature of religious commitments, that sincerity does not rest on measures that are independent of the context in which sincerity is judged. And if the context is going to be, if we're talking about religious sincerity, then in some sense sincerity has to be internal to religious, the religious faith of the people who have that are making a claim. I also actually think that for all their faults, courts and judicial bodies have some significant virtues that are worth taking advantage of when it comes to assessing these disputes. So it's not only that I think it's unrealistic, I don't think we would want courts not to assess disputes having to do with religious freedom and equality, even if they do require courts assessing matters internal to religions. For one reason I think this is because I think courts provide controlled environments where opportunistic and strategic behavior of religious or other elites can be exposed. I think that religious bodies have considerable power and potential to provide public guidance to other institutions. And I think that legal reasoning is open to critical reflection in democratic societies. So courts are obligated by constitutional principle to reflect on whether the principles they apply treat the diversity of citizens as equals. And insofar as courts are designed, they're public institutions that we can design and have some control over, and insofar as they are designed in ways that give judges incentives to be open to these kinds of values, then we ought to use them and design them in a way that allows judicial bodies to outline public methods of decision-making that are attentive to the risks of assessing the commitments of others in a fair and even-handed manner, without capitulating to every claim made in the name of religious freedom and equality. So I think the potential is great for public institutions and specifically courts to play a leading role, even if this potential is sometimes unrealized. And so the question is, how do you realize the potential? And so here I want to just, in the 5 minutes I have left, sketch out two frameworks of policy reform that I think are promising. One I call institutional humility, and the other I call democratic space. So I think that these are frameworks. So they're kind of vague and principled, and I'll give you examples what I mean, but my work is trying to hash out what they mean. So first of all, institutional humility. Reforms that enhance institutional humility engender a capacity of public institutions to reflect on their own limitations and develop avenues that overcome narrow and faulty interpretations of principles, rules, and procedures. So techniques of humility encourage an openness and an openness to the subjective, partial, personal, fluid, limited, and located nature of all human decision-making, while nevertheless recognizing the necessity of making decisions. So what that means is that the position of humility rejects an endless epistemological play, limitless self-subversion, and limitless deconstructive technique. When we think about what forces us to be humble, we think about in the project of decision-making, it must include a recognition of the responsibility to make decisions, but to make decisions in a context of profound diversity, sometimes of unknowable diversity and unknown diversity. So for instance, I'll give you an example of this. Efforts to diversify the judiciary by recruiting women, indigenous people, and members of underrepresented religious minority groups into the judicial ranks display institutional humility, insofar as they reflect an attentiveness to the ways in which a diversity of experiences and circumstances can generate different legitimate perspectives on what the abstract principles of constitutional and other forms of law mean. Instead of treating differences as something that can flourish only in the private domain, recruitment programs that diversify decision makers establish public ways in which the manifestations of difference can be confronted. At the same time, the presence of different voices enhances the capacity of courts to identify and hopefully avoid entrenching stereotypes or essentializing religious groups. So the idea of humility indicates and calls attention to the contextual and on-the-ground factors that should inform legal and political decision-making if the values protected by abstract rights are going to be effectively translated into real-world circumstances in which individuals actually lead their lives. It's always going to be imperfect because everybody only represents a partial and narrow perspective on an issue. And therefore the risk of incorporating others in this way is that those others will never displace, they will only displace one kind of bias for another. And I recognize that, but that points to what I think is the inevitable partiality of decision-making, no matter how expansive and inclusive, not an objection to the attempt to try. Let me just go on for the last 2 minutes to talk about democratic space. So democratic space is the idea, and it's my attempt to really speak to those who think that participatory, non-judicial resolutions, dialogue outside a legalistic environment or a court environment is the way in which to solve all these problems, and I think that's a limited vision of democracy. I think that what's really interesting is some of the ways in which democratic space is created by legal institutions. So democratic space aims at enhancing the capacities of public institutions to identify circumstances in which the mechanisms of consultation, deliberation, inter- and intra-community participation can be useful to provide information about groups, and often the contested meaning of their practices. The goal, the aim of democratic space, is a recognition that decision-making about religious identity sometimes entrenches stereotypes, elite hierarchies, narrow and distorting understandings of group-based beliefs and commitments, but those risks are greatest where people are unable to challenge inherited categories, canonical interpretations, and elite-inspired scripts about what their identity consists in. So judges and bureaucrats and legislatures may be less inclined to entrench stereotypes about a group if they're confronted with evidence about the diverse and pluralistic nature of group-based values and the hybridity of group members. So in Canada, for example, to give you some examples, democratic space is created by commissions of inquiry, such as the 2004 Boyd Commission on Religious Arbitration in Ontario, the 2009 Bouchard-Taylor Commission on Reasonable Accommodation. Both have been helpful at identifying identity claims of religious minorities and the risks associated with them. Courts and legislatures have also enhanced democratic space by taking special notice of community-based solutions to disputes, which display fidelity to a broad, inclusive forms of participation, and thereby strengthen attempts of citizens to sort out conflicts on a matter in a manner consistent with democratic values. And here I'm thinking of Denise Rayu, who did a very interesting essay a long time ago, actually, about court decisions about rival conflicts in churches, where the churches had different kinds of democratic organizations, and the legitimacy of those decisions depended partly on the democratic organization of churches, according to her. So democratic solutions, now there's a risk here. Democratic solutions will favor dominant interests and can marginalize minorities. And yet we find this risk is much greater where no democratic space exists for minorities to contest claims about religious identity. So in short, democratic space may be necessary even if it's not a sufficient condition for responding to the claims of religious minorities fairly, and in ways that can best advance the normative values of these claims while mitigating some of the risks which accompany them. So I have an artful conclusion, but I think that in the interest of my co-panelists, I will just say thank you.